So the average person will go through 3 dozen disruptors, as I call them, in the course of their lives. 1 in 10 of them become significant. This is what I call a lifequake. And the way you get through a lifequake is a life transition. If we're just suffering through this, we're missing half our lives. Let's find a life in the transitions, and let's use these as opportunities to remake ourselves, because that's the opportunity that life gives us.
How should we be teaching people differently the skills for a nonlinear existence versus a linear existence?
Let me take a half a step back and sort of say what I learned. Okay, so the first thing I learned is that the linear life is dead. It's been replaced by the nonlinear life, and the nonlinear life, I have all this data. So let's use your language, and it happens to be the language that I use. So the average person will go through 3 dozen disruptors, as I call them, in the course of their lives. That's 1 every 12 to 18 months. Okay, that's like more often than most people see the dentist. And most of these we get through very, pretty well. Like it turns out we're pretty adaptive. A disruptor can be as small as twisting your ankle or having a fender bender, or as big as losing a loved one.
Did you say 3 dozen?
3 dozen. Okay?
3 dozen significant disruptions, like zigs or zags in the supposedly linear path, basically.
Okay, let me quibble only with the word disruptor. 3 dozen disruptors in our lives, small, medium, or large.
Okay.
Most of them are relatively easy to get through, but 1 in 10 of them becomes significant. So 1 in 10 of them becomes a big, massive change. This is what I call a lifequake, and that one is bigger. So that one is a sort of, it's either a disruptor on steroids, or it's a massive shared disruptor, like say the pandemic was, or it's a pileup of multiple disruptors, right? Okay, just when you lose your job, your spouse is diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and your child has an anxiety disorder. So suddenly life is completely overwhelming to you. That's a lifequake, and we have 3 to 5 of those in a lifetime. And so if you here's a key piece of data. The average length to get through them, 5 years. So if you do the math, 3 to 5 in a lifetime, 4, 5, 6 years, that's 25 years. That's half of our adult lives we are spending in this state of disruption. And the way you get through a lifequake is a life transition. Okay? So think of it this way. Think of the lifequake puts you on your heels, and the life transition is what puts you back on your toes. Okay. So the 3 kind of big lessons of the Life Story Project is: number 1, the linear life is dead. Number 2, the nonlinear life involves many more life transitions. And the third beat is exactly what you just asked me, which is life transitions are a skill that we can and must master. And so it's breakable down. I've got phases, I've got tools, as you know. I'm happy to go through them.
And this is in your book, Life is in the Transitions. You have kind of the tool, the transition toolkit.
In Life is in the Transitions, there is a transition toolkit. There is a TED Talk, The Secrets of Mastering a Life Transition, where you can get it in 17 minutes. Wow. You can subscribe to my newsletter, The Nonlinear Life. All this is available if you go to brucefeiler.com. And twice a week, I am analyzing and talking about this. I've done another 150 stories. I'm now up to 400. I've written a book about nonlinear work lives called The Search that will be out in the spring of 2023. So this is my life. My life is, we are going through transitions all the time. We have to normalize the transition, because this gets to the heart of what I think where we have a lot in common. We have thought and talked about the lifequakes, the disruptors, and the transitions as the aberrant time. Okay, I just got to suffer. Think of the language. We have to grit our way through, right? We have to be resilient. Well, resilient is a linear term. The word resilience comes from a spring. It actually has to do with the physics of how much flexibility there is in the spring, and then the spring bounces back. That's not what happens. A small number of people bounce back. Many more people bounce forward or sideways or a different place entirely. So I want to say, if we're just suffering through this, we're missing half our lives. Let's find a life in the transitions. Let's find the renewal. Let's find the growth. And let's use these as opportunities to remake ourselves, because that's the opportunity that life gives us.
I love word origins. I'm kind of like, if Google, if you could see like a word cloud of my Google searches, literally the word etymology, I guarantee you would be the biggest word. So I just searched the word resilient, and it comes from the Latin resilire, to leap back.
Yes.
And I love what you're saying, because we really ought to be looking at these as opportunities to leap forward.
Bingo. Or sideways or
leap elsewhere.
Yep.
But there is no, return to normal, so to speak. By the way,
let's just talk about the pandemic is a great example of that. Because when the first thing happened, everyone was quarantined, we all thought we're going to suffer for 6 weeks and we're going to go back. And we were never going back. And it took a while to say goodbye. That's why of the 3 phases of a life transition, the first is the long goodbye. It's accepting that you're not going back. Okay. And then that leads to the messy middle, which is sort of, shedding habits and creating new ones. And the new beginning is embracing whatever direction you're going. But yes, you have to give up the idea that we're not going back.
You've had an incredibly interesting career. I assume you think it's interesting. I think it's interesting. Most people in this world don't get to have such interesting careers. Most people kind of do one thing and they do it until they hopefully can retire. How would you say you have managed to create for yourself such a rich and diverse and interesting life that is so unlike anybody else I've ever met? Like, what's the secret?
The secret is that I'm uninteresting, and therefore I have decided that the only way for me to be interesting, to stick with the to beat this horse to death, is to go out and do interesting things. Right. So I think that in an odd kind of way, that's how I see it. Like there's multiple ways of telling the story of my life as the story of all lives. We can tell them in multiple ways, but one way of telling it is that I grew up, in Savannah, Georgia, right, in a suburb, and I went to school and I played sports and played sports mediocrely and played piano poorly, and then left there and went to college in this case in New England. And I found that I kind of learned about myself as a Southerner by leaving the South and going to the North. Right. And so I sort of found that process of dislocation exciting and revealing and interesting, for lack of a better word. And this was the 80s, and it was the age of discount airfare. And I was like, oh, well, the next logical thing is to leave the country. So I spent the second half of my junior year at Yale in Japan. And this is a kind of where it all began in a lot of ways, is I was staying with this family. I didn't speak a word of Japanese. They didn't speak a word of English. In fact, you can't tell on this Zoom, but I'm somewhat tall. I'm almost 6'2". And this family in Japan only had a short bed, and they went around to all of their neighbors and got microwave and TV boxes and put them at the end of the bed so that my feet didn't stick out.
Right.
Like, this was like this incredibly warm and welcoming thing. And it was all going well. And then the mother of this homestay family, her name is Makiko, who had like a little, like two almost like science project, I don't know, what do you call them, of like a stovetop kind of things, and a microwave. Like that was all
like little burners.
Like that was the whole kitchen. She produces this like 10-course meal. It was the most amazing thing. And the highlight, what do you serve someone when they're a guest in your home? Your favorite dish, speaking of Gourmet Magazine, where as you said, I won 3 James Beard Awards. Her marquee dish was liver pie. Now, I will go anywhere. I've been to 90 countries in my life. I will I'll ask almost anybody, almost any question. I will eat almost anything, but liver would be on the short list of things that I would not eat.
So what kind of liver? Beef?
It was beef liver. And
beef liver. Okay.
It would look like an apple pie. It was like that kind of crust, and inside was liver. And I suffered through this liver pie because I'm trying to make a good impression, right? Because I'm like the good, suburban kid from Georgia. And I go upstairs and I sleep in my bed with the microwave boxes. And I get up and I learn my first lesson about life in Japan. And that is that breakfast is cold leftovers from the night before. So I'm served cold liver pie on a Sunday morning. And this will date me to all of the kids out there listening, but I got up and I had a pad of crinkly airmail paper. Now, for those of you who don't know, it's like an onion skin paper. It's very thin. There were no lines. In fact, the pad had lines so that you wouldn't have to write everywhere. And I wrote a letter home. Like, you're not going to believe what happened to me. And I wrote one of these letters essentially probably 4 or 5 times a week for the next 6 months. And when I got back to Georgia, everywhere I went, people said, I loved your letters. And I was like, great, have we met? And it turned out that my grandmother had Xeroxed them back when they had Xerox machines and passed them around. And this letter went viral in the sort of the old-fashioned sense of the word. And I'm like, well, if this is that interesting to me and to all these other people, like, I should write a book about it. Mm-hmm. I didn't know anyone who'd ever written a book, right? I literally went to the library, the Chatham-Effingham Public Library in Savannah, Georgia, and got out the only book on, this was before the internet, of course, the only book on publishing, which was a book about propaganda in World War II. Is
that Goebbels?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was American propaganda, but still, okay. The point is how we countered Goebbels and how we countered, for the record, the Japanese.
Okay.
And so this was, and this was an absurd idea. This was unhelpful. My mother ran into someone like at the Piggly Wiggly, whose like daughter had written a book on temping, and she's like, "Oh, my son has an agent," and one thing leads to another. And it doesn't happen this way, but I sold my first book at 24 and I've never held a job since. And it was this process of like going to places, interesting, unusual, out of my comfort zone, becoming a part of them, because I am 2 things fundamentally. I am an experientialist. Okay. I like having experiences, and then I'm an explainaholic. And so I like go to these places, and then I like telling what happened to me. And I sold my first book at 24, and I've lived this life with the single-minded obsession of like, can I get to do it again?
That's a fascinating story. So let me get this straight. Your grandmother, without permission or disclosure, was publishing your letters home and distributing them locally around town.
Well, she wasn't publishing them in the newspaper,
or she was printing them.
She was printing them, and yes, people would pass them around, and it's sort of, it's what is going viral today on the internet mean, like, people are interested.
Right.
And so it just communicated to me that this kind of way, and by the way, to date myself, this was a time when you could not open a newspaper, back when we had newspapers, and read an article about Japan. Like, that was the center of the world in the 1980s. And so it just seemed like, oh, well, I should do this. And this is basically all I've ever done.
The 1980s, Japan was the second largest economy in the world. And it was, that's like the whole Toyota, automotive revolution and manufacturing revolution, right? Mitsubishi electronics revolution. Like, it was a big deal.
Everything. And everybody wanted to understand it because it was mysterious. In fact, I was, the only foreigner in this town of like 50,000 people when I was teaching. So they were new. In fact, the program that I was in was actually run by the Japanese government, and it was designed to take foreigners and stick them in rural Japan, specifically to teach them, the Japanese, to be more international.
Oh, so you weren't even in a big city?
No. I was in the middle of nowhere. And so I wrote this book called Learning to Bow, and this is what my life has been like. So I'm amazed that we're in this, 5 minutes into this conversation. I'm interested, and you haven't also mentioned one of the stranger things about me, which is, so then I wrote a book about Japan. Then I wrote a book about Oxford and Cambridge based on a master's degree. And then I spent a year in the circus.
Yeah, that's right. You were a clown.
I was a clown in the Clyde Beatty Cole Brothers Circus. And I wrote this book called Under the Big Top. And then I was in Nashville writing a book about country music. And at that time, I was living across the street from 3 churches. And I thought, well, I should be more conversant with the Bible, because I hadn't really read the Bible since I was a kid. So I put my bar mitzvah Bible by my shelf, and it sat there for 2 years gathering dust. And I went to see an old friend in Jerusalem. And on my first day, my friend said, here's this controversial neighborhood. Here's the rock where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. And I was like, whoa, like, these are real places you can feel. Yeah. And that's when I had this idea to retrace the Bible. And so that's Walking the Bible came out of that. And then basically that was a big book. It's been a year and a half on the bestseller list. And I spent basically the next decade going back, making books and making television about religion. And this was in the 9/11 years. And so this was at the front of the world at that time.
So immediate question that jumps to mind for me, and to contextualize a little bit, and for the audience too, and the audience in general, I would say of this show is people that are like looking to live. They've either made the transition to living more, off the beaten path lives than say the norm, or they're thinking about it, right? Like unlocking your potential. Plus I'm an entrepreneurial teacher and educator. And so it's kind of like this, what does the road less traveled look like? And maybe I want to go walk it. That's sort of the audience, the zeitgeist of the show. Right. So for context, or one of the most important contextual considerations for anybody looking to live that sort of non-traditional life, and you've pretty much like, embody that to a T, is like, what about responsibilities? So I'm curious, I know you're married. I know you have kids. Were you married during any of this time when you were off gallivanting around doing all this crazy stuff? And to the extent, and you probably still are off gallivanting around.
Right,
but
exactly. So, yeah. So the short answer to this is the person I married is a gallivanter, right? So nice. for much of this time, the answer to that was no. Right. So in my 20s, I started early doing this and was into my 30s. And sooner or later through this whole process, I ended up back in New York. You said you were a compulsive hydrator. I didn't realize you actually were going to be drinking from a rooftop New York City apartment building water tower. But okay.
Yeah, exactly. Every day, this whole thing disappears.
So I end up in New York. And I start, and I'm dating, and I end up meeting this woman who would become my wife. Her name is Linda. And I should talk a little bit about her because, in fact, she's the entrepreneur in the family. So her name is Linda Rotenberg. She started and co-founded and runs an organization called Endeavor that supports high-impact entrepreneurs in 41 countries around the world. So they have screened 250,000 entrepreneurs and picked, I don't think 25,000 at this point, who last year had $10 billion of revenue. So entrepreneurship literally is pillow talk in my family. And, in fact, when you started this riff about interesting at the top, I have to say the scene that came to my mind was in almost 20 years ago, in 2003, in my hometown of Savannah, when we got married. The twin rabbis who actually were doing this marriage actually said, when describing what I do, like, who does what you do? Right. And also when talking about what she does, said, who does what you do? And I think that one of the things that we connected about is that we both have these non-traditional lives, but we also, in a kind of a certain way, come from traditional backgrounds and want to have a traditional family. And so I think it is that commitment to have what we now have 17-year-old identical twin daughters, to always have a parent on the children, means that we spend a lot of time juggling these various lives. And so I guess I want to put a flag. And this, of course, has become, as we get toward my work today, the essence of what I'm doing. I want to put a flag that you can have a non-traditional work life and a traditional family life if that is what you want. And I think, if anything, I would go, I don't even think it's out on a limb to say the world today is more welcoming of non-traditional work lives than at any time, probably in the last 2,000 years of work. In fact, the abnorm is becoming the norm. I've actually written a new book, just turned it in last week, that will be out in the spring of 2023, specifically about having non-traditional work lives and how people do it and how to find it out. So maybe that will tee up a future conversation. But the essence of what I'm doing now, and I've been doing the last 5 years, is trying to identify what are the elements of kind of linear lives, as I call them, and nonlinear lives, and how can we get ourselves out of the trap that life is traditional, life is linear, life follows a customary path, because it turns out that path that many of us are raised on, that's the aberration. Man,
thank you for saying what I believe more artfully than I usually do. And I noticed your newsletter is called The Nonlinear Life, which is great. So I think you really nailed something that's so important and that I really see as a need in the market. If I look at call it the entrepreneurial thought leader influencer space, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a pretty broad category, but if I think of sort of like some guys that come to mind, Gary Vee, definitely. I think he's divorced now, but he never really talked and he had kids, but never talks about his family. Right. Tai Lopez, as far as I know, doesn't have one. Who else? I don't know. Who else comes to mind? Grant Cardone, non-traditional, definitely super into family, but it really doesn't seem very relatable. He flies around on jets all the time with their homeschool teacher and the family goes, right. It's there's nobody who's just going home every day at 6:00 to eat dinner and play with the kids and live in a house that maybe people can relate to, but is also, I shouldn't say there's nobody. That's a gross overstatement, but you know what I mean? That's not the norm. Like what you're describing is people that are out there living their dream, living their passion, living the exact life that they would design in their perfect world. And yet also fitting in, checking all the boxes of quote, normal, high functioning, family balanced life. There's sort of a false dichotomy in the marketplace as an either or, right? And you're right. You're totally right that that's not right. And thank you for proving
it's definitely not right. And it's definitely not right. This is a fascinating conversation, right? And I will pick up the story in a second of how I ended up thinking about this and devoting, much of the last half a decade to thinking about it. And I will get to that in a second, but just to frame it for a second, what I want to say is if you've used this linear, nonlinear idea as a pole, and I'm going to explain what that means in a second, I think that the right way to look at it is that even people who have linearity in certain aspects of their lives, like let's say a longstanding relationship or a longstanding job, right? Mm-hmm. Or a commitment to raising children, have nonlinearity elsewhere in their lives. Maybe they've had medical ups and downs. Maybe they've gone through addiction and are now in recovery. Okay. Or maybe they've gone through family changes. So what nobody has is complete linearity. Yeah. But also what no one has is complete nonlinearity either. It's a constant struggle. So with that frame to kind of meet your moment, let me just go back in the story and tell you how I ended up here, because the story that I'm telling you in the frame that I have now is a kind of linear life. I figure out what I want to do early. I do it for no money for a long time. Then I have huge success. I get married and I have children. And if we were having this conversation when I was 40, I would have been that guy that you didn't like, right? Who appeared to sort of have it all in a lot of ways. But then in my 40s, I was just bombarded with life. Okay. First, as you know, I got cancer, a rare aggressive cancer in my left leg when we had 3-year-old twin daughters. That was incredibly disruptive. You mentioned the Council of Dads. What I did partly in response to that was to ask a group of friends to be present in the lives of my children in the event that I died. I wrote a memoir about this called The Council of Dads. It became a series on NBC. But I also had financial trouble. My family owned, in the recession of 2008, my family owned real estate in Georgia that all got wiped out. And then my dad, who has Parkinson's, got very depressed and tried to take his own life 6 times in 12 weeks. So this was, by any measure, a crisis. And really what it was is what I've come to call a pileup, like one crisis on top of another, on top of another. And I didn't know what to do. And especially as somebody who is by this point a professional storyteller, I didn't know how to tell the story of my life. How do you tell this part? Do you not tell? Do you share? Do you overshare? Do you keep this quiet? Do you suffer silently? Do you tell everybody, how are you doing? Well, do you really want to know? Let's go into it. No, I didn't know how to do it. And what I began to realize, and I sort of experienced it firsthand, is when I did start to tell this story, everybody had their own version. Everybody had one or some collection of times when the life they were living was not the life they expected to live, like that they were living life out of order. Like that was sort of the idea that was vivid in my mind. Like people were saying, like, this isn't supposed to be happening to me. Like, I'm not that person. Why is this happening to me? I thought I was going to have the orderly life I expected, and I am not. And this sort of all came to head at a college reunion of now 5 years ago. And I called my wife and I was like, you know what? No one knows how to tell their story anymore. And I really, the core way I live my life, as I've said over and over again, was go enter an interesting world. Like, what if I enter the world of, oh my God, my life is overwhelming and I don't know what to do about it. Let me enter that world. And so what I did was I created this thing called the Life Story Project. And I began crisscrossing the country, collecting what became hundreds and hundreds of life stories of people who went through all sorts of changes. They lost limbs, they lost homes, they changed careers, they changed religions, they got sober, they got out of bad marriages. And I ultimately ended up with 250 stories, 10,000 hours, 10,000 pages of transcripts. And I got a team of people and I spent a year coding them. Like I would do these conversations over and over, like kind of what you do professionally now. And I would hear certain patterns. And I was like, oh, some people move, or like some people have emotion. Like, and I wanted to understand. So we then spent a year coding these for what became dozens and dozens of variables. And what became the big idea that emerged is that this idea of a linear life, right? That you're going to have one job, one relationship, one home, one spirituality, one sexuality, one source of happiness. That's gone. It's like it's gone and it's been replaced by what I call the nonlinear life. And I was like, I got to understand more about this.
Do you think it's been replaced, or do you think that it was always a false construct, like an illusion from the beginning?
Well, that's a really key question, and it's a hard question. And let me answer it this way. And this will get back to something that we had talked about earlier. It turns out that this idea of linearity, it's the aberration.
Yeah.
So what I mean by that is I spent a lot of time in the ancient world. Remember, I come out of this after 10 years of writing and thinking about religion. And one thing you learn in the ancient world is that there's no time, right? There is no linear time. Like to every season, turn. Like our sense of our law of selves is shaped by our sense of the outside world, basically. Okay. So if we think life is agricultural and follows a seasonal path, we think that's what life should be. And that's what they thought largely in the ancient world. It actually is the Bible.
Wait, sorry, that's what they called what?
That's sort of the idea of a cyclical time. Okay.
Right.
So the life, like your life is going to be in cycles, that you're not in control of it. Like it's bigger than you.
Right.
And you're just going to go through these cycles like everybody else goes through these cycles. It's actually the Bible in the West that introduces the idea of linear time. And so by the Middle Ages, they begin to think that, and they have another shape of life. It's not a cycle, it's a staircase. So they say life is a staircase up to middle age. It peaks in middle age, and then it's downhill from there. And by the way, in the book, Life is in the Transitions, which I'm going to get to in a second, I have these visuals, like men have it, women have it, like, think how confining that is. There's no starting a new company at 44. There's no moving to Florida and opening a B&B or an Airbnb, right? It's straight up and then straight down. There's no new love. There's no second chances. There's no third acts. It's very, very rigid. Okay. And what's interesting is that's the opposite of how we all were raised. Those of us who were raised in the 20th century, where middle age is the bottom. But let's keep going with the story. So then science, the birth of science comes along, and it introduces this idea of linearity. So clocks become widespread in the 1800s, and then everybody how do they look at the world? It's the Industrial Revolution. It's the conveyor belt. It's the assembly line. And sure enough, all the ways people talked about life were Piaget. We have stages as children. Freud, there's psychosexual stages, the 8 stages of moral development, the 5 stages of grief. We could list them for an hour. Right. They're all linear constructs because that's how the world worked at that time. And this reaches its peak in the 70s. A woman named Gail Sheehy writes a book called Passages, which says everyone does the same thing in their 20s and their 30s. And then everyone has a quote unquote midlife crisis. Right. And it was, again, so rigid. 30, it said you must start by 39 and you must end by 44 and a half. Like that's how restrictive it was. And that's where the idea of the midlife crisis comes. It's all bunk. It's not true. Just think about the pandemic. If you were between 39 and 44 and a half, you were having a midlife crisis. But if you're between 24 and 29, you were having a crisis, or 62 and 74, or my teenagers. So the point is, we now know with the internet and network theory and connectivity, and chaos theory, all of these things, we now know that life is nonlinear. But what hasn't happened is we haven't adjusted our expectation of how our lives are going to unfold. So basically, we're still haunted by the ghost of linearity.
Yeah.
Was it ever linear? I don't think so. But you couldn't escape the fact that that's how everybody talked about development. We were all basically washing machines that went along on a conveyor belt that after a time, had built-in obsolescence, and then we were thrown in the junk heap, and then a new washing machine would come along. That's not the way it works.
So I'm curious, and I'm gonna bring what you just said sort of into my camp for a minute. I'm going to appropriate it for my purposes, if you will.
Please.
So a big part of my mission and my work in the world is around education, right? Like I consider myself sort of an educational disruptor. And I'm trying to prepare people for, like, kind of to your point, like we still think the world is linear, but the world isn't. And my premise is that there's a completely different way to educate people about how to thrive in a world that is explicitly nonlinear.
Correct.
Fundamentally, if you think about the educational system, where like there really is linear thinking, and there's this progression, it's this idea of life progression, and it starts in school, but essentially they're pre-conditioning kids that you're going to be on this linear progression, path till you die, and really, like you even said, like the long goodbye, the simple fact that we have to have like this long, drawn out, emotional goodbye is only because we haven't been prepared for the fact that these things are going to happen. And really, you shouldn't make a big deal about it. Like if you already knew the person was leaving, like for the last 5 years, you've been like, I know this person's going to not live with me forever. Then like, you don't need to spend 6 months saying goodbye. You're just like, oh, bye. I knew this day was coming. Have a nice life and move on to the next thing. But it's like the fact that we're so caught off guard.
Yes.
When the unexpected, it's like the unexpected should be the expected at this point. But we're still teaching kids that life is this expectable, predictable, plannable thing.
I think that's right. And now we get to the pandemic again, because I think that if it's taught us anything, it's the problem with that, actually. Okay, so let me just talk about this for a second. So I have all these Lifequakes, and I decide to break them down. And I did it on 2 axes, okay? So the first one I did on, okay, so what's a Lifequake? As I said, a Lifequake is losing a loved one, it's losing a limb, it's losing your job, but it's also quitting a job, or it's also, moving to a new place, as we see in, I just wrote a piece on my newsletter about, 10 million Americans have relocated since the pandemic began, and red state people are moving to blue states, and blue states to red states. It's interesting. It kind of, it breaks it down, a lot of the divisions that we think we see. So the first way I divided these Lifequakes was voluntary versus involuntary. Okay. So that was about 50-50. I think it was like 57% involuntary and 43% voluntary, I think. Mm-hmm. So it was interesting. So I look at I have these, I look at this and I think 43% of Lifequakes are voluntary. People are starting a new enterprise, right? They're moving, like they're embracing the opportunities of the linear life. I have all these millennials on my team who were my coders, and they look on this and I was like, whoa, 57% are involuntary. Like all my planning isn't going to come true. Like, all of the things that I think and I'm going to write on my little, whatever, on my vision board, or my, I'm going to manifest in my diary. They're not going to happen. No, they're not going to all happen, because illness is going to come along, natural disasters are going to come along, things are going to happen. So that was one divide. The other divide I did was voluntary versus involuntary. And here, like, I misspoke. The second one was personal versus collective. Okay. So, and the smallest category was collective involuntary. Okay, I made a little grid. So a collective involuntary life, it would be Vietnam, right? Or 9/11. Okay, a hurricane.
Pandemic.
Well, this is where I'm leading to. So that was like 10%. And there's, as a writer, I would call this a throwaway line in my book, where I was like, I need to comment on this because it's pretty profound. And what I say was, had I done these conversations a century ago, 2 world wars, depression, women's rights, civil rights, we would have had many more collective involuntary. This shows that we're in a time where we can control our lives. Enter the pandemic. So the pandemic is the biggest collective involuntary lifequake in a century. The entire planet is going through one at the same time. And obviously it's been destructive. Obviously we've lost millions of people. People have lost their livelihoods, a bunch of tragedy that we all witness and experience. And I don't want to minimize that in any way. But what it has also done is created a break in the linear train, right? So the linear progression, momentum, expectation, kind of force in our lives was broken. And as a result of the breaking, we then see more people starting enterprises, more people moving, more people getting out of relationships, more people saying, am I doing what I want to be doing? Because fundamentally what a lifequake is a meaning-making exercise, okay? Right, so it's a meaning vacuum. When all the traditional sources of meaning and identity in our lives are sucked out, so we have to rethink, what do I want to be doing? Who do I want to be? Who do I want to be doing it with? Where do I want to be living? And that's the opportunity that these lifequakes give us. But the question is, what do we do? We don't know, which is where this toolkit comes in.
It's so, man, you really just connected 2 dots for me. This concept, because I, as a rabid non-traditionalist who dropped out of high school to become a jazz musician and has been, twisting and turning ever since, I live in sort of a constant state of vexation about how, I'll use your term, how linear people really want to be and try to be and pretend to be, right? It's like pretend's a good word. Yeah. I'm like, life is actually way better if you just let go of this whole nonsense. Right. But people like, you'll pry my linearity out of my cold dead hands, And so, that's good. So I think what you just connected for me helps me understand that better. And it is, you're right. The meaning that we attach to things depends on the linear context in which that thing exists, right? Things have meaning in juxtaposition to their past and their future and their relationship there too. And if all of a sudden life is just this chaotic, like pinballing around from here to there and like nothing's connected, then in a sense, nothing means anything anymore. And that's like existentially terrifying. And so I love what you said, that these disruptions are meaning-making machines where we're forced to create meaning because we lose the context that's been supplying it up to that point. So
that's exactly right. I mean, mostly. I mean, I think that what I would say is that the disruption or the lifequake or the downsizing or the diagnosis or the tornado or the pandemic or whatever it is, that isn't a meaning-making thing. That's the meaning vacuum. That creates the chaos, the fear, the anxiety, the unsureness. What is the meaning-making exercise is the transition. That's the solution for how we get through it. And I think, and people react differently. I mean, what tends to happen when people get in a lifequake is they do one of 2 things, okay? They either make a 212 item to-do list and say, I'm going to get through it in a weekend and be the best ever and get a blue ribbon, and isn't everyone going to be proud of me? Or they lie in a fetal position under the covers with the cat and they say, no one's ever been through this other than me, and woe is me, and my life will never be the same. In effect, both are wrong, right? Because it is emotional, but there is a way through it. You're not going to get through it in a weekend, and you don't want to in a lot of ways, because a lot of these things kind of take time to figure out. So I think that if I could summarize the reaction to my book, to my newsletter, to my TED Talk, and this is a technical academic term, but it's Like you've put a language to these feelings that I have. I remember when I would wander around. I'm talking to you from my home office here in Brooklyn, and I did a lot of my interviews here. And I was wandering around for years saying, why has there not been a book on life transitions in 40 years since the late 70s? Why is this not a term that we're talking about? And I think a lot of it is because of the power of grit and resilience, and the idea that successful people, push through and don't show their emotions and, put their head down. That's just as damaging as the idea of linearity. The idea that suffering is a badge of distinction for dealing with difficult times. No. In fact, one of my 7 tools is share it with somebody else. Other people around you are going through it, and they have wisdom too. And so don't keep it to yourself and stiff upper lip and soldier your way through. That is also an outdated, by the way, masculine, but that's an outdated idea that we don't need to subscribe to. Actually, sharing, talking is a way to get the help that you need.
So I have a couple questions, and it's interesting. Even the term. It comes to mind that even the term that we use, I think, in a lot of these situations is to call it a setback.
Yes.
And that is implicitly a linear way to describe it, right?
It's implicitly a linear way, and it's implicitly a negative way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think they're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, interesting. Nice.
But one thing I'm curious about, and this is maybe getting a little deep here, but you said that the transitions, the disruptions create the chaos, create the meaninglessness, create the vacuum.
Right.
And then the transition is the solution. I'm curious, do you think that it would be accurate, and this is going to say a lot, I guess, about how you view the world and what you believe about it, if we substituted the word create for the word reveal? Would you agree with it? That these disruptions reveal the chaos and reveal the meaninglessness that was always there? Or do you think that they are temporarily creates chaos that is then solvable?
I think it reveals the landscape that then you shape, is what I think. So that I think that it reveals a pattern that has been there all along that you have not been seeing or allowing yourself to not see. Because you think, hey, it's working for me. I got it.
And we're wired to crave predictability so much that if we don't have it, we'll create it, right?
Yeah. But if you look at the greatest stories ever told, first of all, if you look at the spiritual ones, okay, from Abraham leaving his family and going to a place that God doesn't even tell, Moses leading the Israelites into the desert, Jesus going through the 40 years, Paul on the road to Damascus, Muhammad going out, the Buddha going out into the wilderness, over and over again in the spiritual stories. And if you look at the secular stories, okay, if you look at Jason and the Argonauts, Hercules, if you look at Orpheus, if you look at the Dante going down, if you look at the greatest myths, the greatest spiritual stories, the greatest novels, they all have this idea of a person who leaves the stable, predictable, safe world, goes into the wilderness, the desert, the jungle, the forest, has a transformative experience, and then comes back. This is what is revealed is the newness of the sameness of the experience, that it's just never going to go always upward. There's always going to be this time in the darkness. What I think it's fair to say that you create is your path through the woods, because there's not only one path through the woods. And this is where, I've been mentioning here, but we haven't really talked about it, the 3 phases, right? The long goodbye is the last one. Is the first one. The new beginning is the third one. The middle one's the messy middle. And the messy middle involves fundamentally 2 activities. One is shedding old mindsets. Oh, I liked being married to you. I liked it when my parent was still alive. I liked having that job and the status and the money that it came from. I liked what I was like when I was drunk. But it's also getting rid of some habits. I didn't like when I was drunk. I didn't like when I was married to you. I didn't like being a people pleaser. I didn't like having a long commute and I want to change jobs or work from home. So you have to shed various things. And why do you shed? Because it makes room for one of the most astonishing acts in this whole process, which is the creativity. And at the bottom of people's lives, they sing, they dance. I talked to people who took up ballet. I talked to a guy, his name is Zach Herrick. He's Black, adopted by a white family in Kansas. Football player, ended up in the military, ended up in the army, ended up in Afghanistan where he had his face shot off by the Taliban. 31 surgeries between the tip of his nose and the tip of his chin, including having his tongue sewn back on. He talked about displacement, suicide ideation. He thought his life was over. Then someone said, you know what? You need to learn to cook because your tastes have changed. So he says, I learned to poach salmon and to cook pork chops. And suddenly girls wanted to go out with me because I could cook. He then starts to write poetry and then he starts to paint. He says, I used to get out my aggression by splattering the enemy with bullets. Now I get it out by splattering the canvas with paint. He's now married with a child and running a new company in Virginia. People do use creation. And not to go back to the pandemic, but let me go one more time to say, what was the cliche in those early months? What did people do? They started baking. We're going to sourdough our way through it. I may have been the least surprised person in America because that simple act of imagining a loaf of bread or a poem or a painting or a painted birdhouse or a garden allows you to imagine you can make yourself anew. So I think it reveals the opportunity, which you then have to seize, and that's the act of creation. And of course, what is the ultimate story in the beginning of the Bible? Well, how do we get through chaos? It's creation.
Man, you just gave so much support to this sort of, it's a, so a little bit of context. Entra, my education platform, we've essentially built what I would call an entrepreneurial operating system, or we call it entrepreneurial life design. It's like frameworks for living. I think I like your language, frameworks for living a non-linear life and still being able to pay the bills, so to speak. Yes, right. And one of the pieces of the framework that I've always had the most, uncertainty around, like, did I really get it right, is in the way that we architect the professional arena of life, which most people fundamentally think of as either the money they make or the title they hold. Right. And we break it down into what we call 3 value channels, which are finances, authority, and creativity is the third one. And I have this fundamental belief that a truly rich and fulfilling professional life is going to have some element of creativity with uniqueness, such that you're making your indelible imprint on the world through the work that you do in it. Right. And I've always wondered, is that just me projecting because I'm a former jazz musician and I think that everybody in the world needs to be an artist? Or is it really elemental that we need to create as part of our profession, i.e. what we profess within the world? And at least right now, I'm putting another point on the side of yes, that creativity is elemental to professional fulfillment. So thank you for that. I want to also add, and I know that we're about out of time and you have a hard stop, so I'm going to be very quick here, but I also just have to say this idea of, did you say it was 43% of transitions are voluntary and 57 are involuntary? Or was it 47 and 53?
I'm going to actually I have Life is in the Transitions in front of me.
While you're looking that up, I will just say that if there is one thing that I can find as a connective thread through almost everybody that enrolls in Entra in my platform, it's that they're going through some sort of transition.
Yes.
And that's why they're looking for this change. And that's why I'm so interested is I'm actually going to share with our team, hey guys, I think we have data here. All these people that are transitioning, here's how many of them it's by choice, and here's how many it's by chance. So I'm curious, what was the number?
I'm on page 81 of Life is in the Transitions, Mastering Change at Any Age by Bruce Feiler. By the way, when's that interesting person coming on board this conversation? And it says that 57% of Lifequakes and this is based on thousands of them that I have analyzed, are involuntary. And 43% are voluntary.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I'm going to just tell you straight up, I wish we did not have to end this conversation, because I think the jury is going to render a most interesting man alive verdict, or at least maybe one of them at least. This has been a fantastic conversation. I am so grateful. I cannot wait to read that book. I haven't read it. Life is in the Transitions. I am going to read this. It's on Audible or on audiobook, I assume.
I read it in literally in a closet in an Airbnb in my own house during the pandemic, because we couldn't go to a studio. So I read it my own self.
I totally know that experience. This is my book. It's actually being published in 14 days. It'll be in bookstores. And I know that I was in a studio, but it was effectively a closet. I know the closet. I spent about 24 hours in that closet. Listen, Bruce, I know you have to go. How can the world go get more of you? You mentioned brucefeiler.com. Where else?
Yeah, Bruce Feiler, FEILER.com. As I said, there's a TED Talk, How to Master a Life Transition, that this week will hit 1 million views. Life is in the Transitions is a New York Times bestseller. As I said, I have a newsletter. I'm at Bruce Feiler at all social media. I have a newsletter on Bulletin. It's brucefeiler.bulletin.com, or go to my website and link to it. And you know what? What I believe is that we're not going to get through this alone. We're all in transitions, and let's master them together. And I appreciate all the connections, and let's do it again.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. The nice thing about nonlinear living is we're more apt to bump into each other if we're not going in straight lines, right? If you loved that episode, then you're definitely going to love this one. Check it out.
We are growing a nation of victims. But the problem is there's so many individuals who have broken out of that, who said, you know what, you may tell me that, but that ain't going to apply to me. I refuse to be the victim. I'm going to be a victor. I'm going to drive forward. You know why? Self-leadership.